We'll get started. What we're going to do is we're going to be. I don't have my syllabus. Let me look at it. We're going to get caught up next week. So what we're going to do tonight is go through chapter 20. I'm going to adjust my notes, and next week we'll be caught up. So I'm going to adjust my notes, and what we're going to do is through the rest of the speeches, we're just going to do an overview of what the speeches are about. Okay? Not that the speeches aren't important, but it's an 8-week course. You know, there are 42 chapters. So we're going to have to do an overview of the speeches. Because I want to spend a little, I want to cover Eliphaz's speeches a little closer because he's forerunning for God's entrance into the situation. And we certainly want to cover 38 through 42 in a little more depth. But Eliphaz enters into the conversation in chapter 32. So what we'll do, we'll overview chapters 21 through 31 next week, and so we'll be where we need to be. But anyway, we'll pick up in chapter 15 here in just a moment and get through chapter 20. You already have those notes, by the way. Does everybody have the notes? I don't know what we got right here. Let me get Peter to... Can you run off a copy 15 through 20 for me? For Jim, Brother Jim? Okay. Yeah. Brother Peter's going to run those off, Jim. So anyway, we're going to have a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Brother Reggie, why don't you lead us in a prayer, and we'll get started. All right, chapter 15. Now, last week we ended with Job's speech. He talked about his understanding. He had a limited understanding of the Hadean realm. He understood that in chapter 14 that you had to die to be able to go to Sheol. He continued his lamentation, verses 16 through 22, and he talked about, he was, obviously Job's in a deep state of depression, and he made the mention, and it's kind of a pitiful situation or a pitiable situation, that he seemed to feel like God was keeping a pretty close score on what was going on. Because he makes mention, he said, I'm not living in sin, and so God is really putting me under a microscope, really keeping score. Every misstep I make, God's marking it down to my account. And so that's a really a pitiable situation for someone to feel that way. And so that brings us to chapter 15, and not Eliphaz, Elihu rather at the end. But anyway, Eliphaz, he begins another round of speaking, and he accuses Job. He began to, and we notice as these men talk, they get harsher and harsher, and he becomes very insulting of Job. And basically what he says something that Bildad said very similar back in chapter 8. Basically, he calls Job a windbag. He says, you're just full of hot air. In fact, he described him as the east wind. Now, if you lived in Palestine or you live in the Middle East, The east wind is something that farmers feared because it came across the desert. And it came across the desert and it destroyed crops. It was devastating. And so if someone said, boy, you're just full of the east wind, you're just full of hot air, what you said was worthless. And so that was a great insult to someone when they said that. He opined that a wise man wouldn't speak such vain words. And so, in essence, he said that what you're saying doesn't have any profit to it. You're just speaking. You're just saying words. They don't even mean anything. And in verses 4 through 5, he said, you're not even showing reverence to God. You're just being irreverent, in fact. And here's the argument that he was putting forth. He's saying your statement is, thank you, Brother Peter. Your statement is that bad things happen to everybody. You're saying that people live in the same world and bad things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. He said, well then the statement you're making, what's the point of even praying to God and asking Him for anything? You're doing away with religion. You're doing away with praying to God. You're doing away with all of that. Why would we even expect God to help us? Now think about that for a moment. That's got to be the stupidest argument in the world. He's making Job's point by saying that. That's why we would pray to God, isn't it? Because we live under the same circumstances as everyone else. Isn't that why we would reach out to God and explain to God what our situation is? To help lift us up out of the same problems that everyone else is facing? He's the one that's full of the hot eastern air, isn't he? Wasn't he the one that was just speaking words that he didn't know what meant? He's just full of himself. He made the point. He made Job's argument for himself. It's clear righteous people face hardships. Sometimes bad people don't face hardships. So why wouldn't a righteous person want to pray to God? Eliphaz hadn't come to that understanding. And he claimed Job's words condemned him. Of course, Job was innocent of all the charges they'd laid at him, because from the very beginning God had said Job was a righteous man. Job 1 verse 8, Job 2 verse 3. There was no one like Job. He turned away from evil. So, being very sarcastic, Eliphaz asked Job if he was the oldest man on earth. Have you outlived everyone else? You know, it's just so infuriating to read this passage and the way that Eliphaz was speaking to Job. Do you think you know more than anyone else in the world? When we're looking back at this and we're seeing that Job is the righteous man, it angers us. We're embarrassed for these men, or at least I read it and I'm thinking, you people are so embarrassing. They're asking Job, well, what do you know that we don't know? In fact, if you know something, Job, we know more. It's like the old schoolyard bully, right? My dad can beat up your dad. My dad's stronger than your dad. My dad knows more than your dad knows. That's how they're acting, and that's how they're behaving toward Job. Well, if you know something, we know more than you know. Have you been around longer than anyone else that you can't learn something? Well, they're the ones that came with the closed mind. They're the ones that came already determining that Job had sinned, or else he wouldn't be in this situation. And the whole point of Eliphaz even being there was to disprove Job's righteousness. That was the whole point of these three men. They didn't want to listen. They didn't want to understand. They didn't want to have empathy or even sympathy for Job. They wanted to prove that he was wrong. And their condescension is so blatant that they're saying, listen, if you'll just shut up and pay attention, you might learn something. It's sickening. We have that through verse 19. And then, beginning with verse 20, Eliphaz begins to explain how the wicked suffer in this life. All the wicked suffers in this life. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to overwhelm Job with all this evidence. Have you ever noticed that people who argue a lot of the time that do not have strong argument or they do not have evidence, their argument consists of talking louder than the other person, faster than the other person, and not allowing the other person to return or to reply with an argument? That's what these men are doing to Job. It's just bam, 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 bam as they're speaking. They're just trying to overwhelm Job with senseless, quote, evidence. Well, it doesn't make sense. He describes the wicked man as someone who spends all of his life in pain, like a woman in childbirth. Well, of course, we have to keep this in the proper context. At the time they're speaking, when a woman was having a child, she was in pain. It's not like today, unless you choose to have like a natural childbirth. You know, we have things for that now that can prevent pain in childbirth, usually. But there's always pain up to that point where they give you the epidural. But what about this? Does the wicked man spend his entire life in pain, in agony, in defeat? That's just ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. According to Eliphaz, the wicked even has trouble getting food. He searched for food without success. And as we read this, we might even consider, well, I wonder how poor old Job's getting his food. After all, what was one of his great losses? His herds, livestock. And so that plays right into the hands of these men, right? Well, see, there you go, Job. The wicked man, he's having to scratch out a living somewhere because he can't even feed himself. That's you, Job. That's his point. Distress, trouble, anguish, that destroys confidence, right, of the wicked. He always lives in fear and gloom. It's as if a powerful king was about to make war against the wicked at all times. You're under stress and anguish. And he's in that position because he defies God. Now, is all of that wrong? Well, no, it's not all wrong. I mean, that may be true in a lot of situations. It's just like the illustration. Now, defiance toward God will cause some of those things to happen. And in some cases, that may be the history of a person who is defiant toward God. That defiance toward God is definitely out there. But that doesn't mean the person who demonstrates that defiance is going to be punished in this life. It's just like the illustration. And I've read this, and I'm sure that y'all have read it too, just like the atheistic college professor who stood in front of the class trying to prove God did not exist, and he said, shaking his fist toward the ceiling, saying, if God exists, let him strike me dead right now. And he stands there for a moment, and nothing happens. And then he raises his fist in triumph because nothing happened, as if God didn't exist. So that's pure defiance in the face of God. But God didn't strike him dead because that man is insignificant to anything in the world. Not that he's insignificant to God, because God loves all people and souls and wants all people and souls to be saved. But in the big scheme of things, is that one little small man going to throw off God's purposes? No. No. Can he prove God doesn't exist? Absolutely not. He's just simply defiant in the face of God. And that's what Eliphaz is depicting Job as. by saying, I'm innocent. He's saying, well, you're just shaking your fist in the face of God, and because of that, He's crushing you right now. Well, that's not true. Eliphaz's description in verses 28 through 31 depicts how the wicked man lives in abandoned cities because he can't live in a normal abode of regular humans. He's been driven out of the cities, and even in the places where he lives, it's rubble, and God's going to destroy all of that because you're reaping what you're going to sow or what you have sown. Well, according to Eliphaz in verses 32 through 35, you meet an untimely death. That's what's going to happen to all wicked men. That just doesn't make sense. And even though that was the common belief at the time, listen, it was not possible for anyone to actually believe that at the time because you could see wicked people prevailing even during the flood. What eventually wiped out the whole wicked world, it took God to do it because they were prevailing. They were being successful, weren't they, in this world? And God finally had to be fed up with them and just destroy the world. Their wickedness alone was not doing it. But Eliphaz uses figures of farming, the plant dying before it could produce the intended fruit. He says, you're like a grapevine that's shaken. Well, all the grapes fall off before they get ripe. Or you're an olive tree, and just as the flower is coming in, well, the flower gets knocked off, so it doesn't produce an olive. Well, that's what happens to the wicked men, he says. Well, that's not true. That may happen to some folks, but it doesn't happen in general to everyone who's wicked. Whatever the reason for his hypocrisy, he says hypocrites will come to nothing because he's consumed by wrath. Well, sometimes that's true. But consider Job here, and let's connect this to the last passage in the chapter. And it's interesting if you know ancient proverbs and ideas like this, and this opens up the passage a little bit for us. Job was a sheik, or head of a tribe, okay? We said in 29 verse 7. Well, part of his destruction was fire came down from heaven and destroyed part of his possessions. Well, there was an ancient proverb declaring the dwellings of the man who could be bribed would be consumed by fire. Well, that wasn't a coincidence that Eliphaz brought that up here at the end of the passage, is it? He's intending and accusing Job of being someone who could take a bribe because Job was a man of some authority. Chapter 29, verse 7, a type of a magistrate. So he's saying, see, you're reaping what you sowed. You were dishonest. Well, Job was never dishonest. Eliphaz didn't know what he was talking about. Bad things happen to good people. And it was on principles just like that Job's friends were basing their argument. And they said, hey, our conduct is reasonable. And this is why we're going after Job. Chapter 16. So Job answered. He said that, boy, of all the comforters in the world, you all are the most miserable. You came here, I'd have been much better off without you. Verses 1 through 15. He said, boy, I could have done without this. They had attacked him with false claims, and they had really done it with gusto, hadn't they? They had really gone after him. He wanted to know, too, when's your meanness going to end? Can you imagine being in the shape Job was in? He was down as far as you could go emotionally, mentally, physically. He had run completely out of steam. His cells were down. And they were just as mean as they could be. And he wanted to know, when was that going to stop? And he asked Eliphaz in verse 2, how did you become so emboldened to speak to me this way? You know, all he had heard from his friends were empty words. They didn't have any meaning behind them. Now, again, when we read the words they spoke and the arguments they put forth, some of it was true. They spoke the truth on some level. But they were wrong in applying it to Job. Their philosophy was if a man suffered, he was guilty of some sort of sin. Well, they could not conceive that there was some kind of greater power or greater something behind the scenes at work. They just couldn't allow that to enter into their mind. Of course, Job didn't understand it all either, but they wouldn't even listen that just maybe it just happened. Maybe it just happened. Bad things happen. They wouldn't consider it. Job did need the encouragement. He obviously needed the support, but he didn't receive any of that. It was just a continual criticism and accusation, one right after the other. When's the easiest time to attack somebody? Well, when they're down. That's where we get the saying, right? Kick them while they're down. Low-hanging fruit, we've heard that. You know, don't pick the low-hanging fruit. Reach up a little higher. Job was low-hanging fruit. He was as low, they couldn't even kick him. They had to stomp him. You know, but that's what they were going after. But Job told them, he said, you know, I could do the same thing to you. I could catch you in a bad spot. I could shake my head at you when you say something. I could, you know, it's like rolling your eyes, right? Someone says something, you roll your eyes. Well, that's just disrespectful. That's just being ugly towards someone. Job said, I could heap these bad words on you. I could do the same thing, but I wouldn't do that. And I think knowing what we know about Job after having read the account, I don't believe Job would do that. I think Job understood, though this came years later, he probably understood the words that Solomon later wrote, Proverbs 16:24. Pleasant words are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul, and health to the bones. Well, of course they are. We want to encourage our brethren, right? Especially our faithful brethren when they're down. We want to help them. We don't want to encourage someone in their sin, but we want to encourage our brethren when they're down. Job made this statement here. He said, I'm filled with wrinkles. Well, he was in an absolute no-win situation in his mind. He was in a no-win situation. He grieved over his afflictions, and when he grieved over them, he was rebuked. Well, what if he hadn't said anything? What would these friends then do? Well, your silence says that you recognize you're guilty. Well, I mean, how are you going to win that? But how many of us would be in that situation? You just lost everything that is precious to you. How many of us could keep silent about that? How many of us could not grieve or mourn out loud? Or, I mean, are we all above some kind of a complaint? You know, I don't know anyone that is completely above complaining in some way, right? I don't see it. You know, Job, who was an absolute believer in God, could not understand how things that were so bad all the way across the board for him could come from any other source than God. In fact, he thought God sent it, but he wasn't blaming God. He just said, look, that's his business. He chose it. He's the sovereign. Why? I don't understand why he did it. I'd like to know, but he chose it. Again, I think I don't know, I have to go back and look. Was it chapter 4 maybe? Where, chapter 7, where I think is where Job made his mistake when he said, does God think I am so unruly, like the sea monsters of the sea, that he has to do this to me? I think that's where he made his one mistake. Okay, I think that's for what he repented. But he didn't understand, but he believed that that was God's business. His friends hadn't literally assaulted him physically, but sometimes words do more problems and more damage than physical assault, don't they? And they had just cut him to the bone. In his mind, it appeared he had been forsaken by his friends, his wife, and by God. Had just thrown him out there to wither away on his own. He said his face was foul with weeping, and his eyelids were the shadows of death. Have you ever seen someone who just looked like death? Have you ever heard that phrase? Boy, you just look like... Maybe someone told you you weren't feeling well. They come visit you in the hospital. Not that you want to hear that, but you felt bad. Or have you heard someone talking about someone and they said, boy, they look like death warmed over? You know, that's what Job is saying right here. My eyelids were full of death. I looked like death. I felt like death. Bless his heart. That's the most pitiable expression anyone could say about themselves. And notice what he was doing. He was sitting in sackcloth. And we studied sackcloth, made out of rough animal hide, goat or camel, turned with the hair on the inside so it's up against your body to make you uncomfortable. It's a sign of mourning, to let you, to be uncomfortable in your mourning, let you get closer to your uncomfortableness, your discomfort. This idea to eat ashes is a figurative expression of mourning. It suggests having mourning or grief as your food. His face was red from weeping. There was a shadow of death upon his eyes. Now, we're not to understand that Job was feeling sorry for himself. Now, obviously, he had grief for himself. You know, no one, I don't think in that situation would not grieve for themselves. But I don't think that he is feeling sorry for himself in the sense that is wrong. He's just talking about the grief that he has over his predicament. He wishes he wasn't in it. It's more than he can handle because he feels like he is being oppressed. He feels like he's being forsaken, especially when it comes to being forsaken by God because he's so faithful. Can you imagine what a kick to the gut that must feel like for this man? He mentions that he wants his blood to be uncovered so it could cry out to God. That's very similar to Abel's blood crying out, Genesis 4, verse 10. He wanted to be vindicated by what he felt like was his coming death. Okay? And then he speaks of a witness. A witness, and God is his witness here. That's what he's talking about. While his friends scorned him, they mocked him, they talked down to him, they used sarcasm against him, he knew that his witness would exonerate him. So he's coming to a better understanding through this suffering. Nobody wants to suffer. But does suffering have beneficial effects to it? Well, certainly it does. We read that in the book of James. Suffering can have a beneficial effect if we allow it to. In chapter 17, Job continued. He says his days were extinct. They were winding down, in other words. He felt like his life was nearly over. I feel like that his life would at least go another, however old he was. He was probably around 70 or so. He lived to be 140. But he felt like his life was almost at the end. Well, of course he would. That's the way he saw it. He was deeply depressed, and he was as equally physically depressed. Right? He couldn't see any way out of his circumstances other than just dying. And he pleaded for that. He wanted God to take him. He spoke of the graves in the first couple of verses of chapter 17, in the plural, the graves awaiting him. That's a likely reference to the place where the dead bodies were kept. The cemetery. We call it a cemetery, right? A tomb. Now, Job, in verses 3 through 4, it seems to me he's addressing God directly. He's wanting to deal directly with God about his situation. And he wanted some kind of assurance that God would exonerate him, since he felt like if the evidence was examined, it would demand innocence on his part. I'm innocent. I haven't done anything. Now, he talks about striking hands here. That's like our shaking hands. He's wanting a deal. He's wanting a guarantee, fairness here. And he continued, or he compared his friends here to those who would send robbers to a friend's house to plunder. What kind of friend would set up a situation where they would send robbers to their friend's house? Well, these folks sitting around the fire here outside Job's house. That's who'd do it, right? Such evil would bring consequences to their own children. The children of wicked men suffer harsh consequences of the father's sin, right? That's the idea here. Sometimes the innocent suffer. That's the point. The one who sins is punished, but the innocent suffer. And then in verses 7 through 8, Job begins to talk about what his symptoms were. Because since all this began to happen to him, he said, my eyes are dimming. My body has become weak. I'm in constant misery. And his statement carried this implied charge against his friends. You haven't helped with any of this. In fact, you're piling on. You're making things worse. And then he in verses 9 through 16, he demands, or he tells, I'm going to keep hanging on. I'm going to stay the course. Because why? Why would Job stay the course? Well, that's what righteous people do. Righteous people stay the course. Unlike his friends. Do you think they would be able to stand up under this kind of pressure? Why, they wouldn't have lasted. Well, to begin with, when Satan appeared before God, did he say, hey, have you considered Bildad or Eliphaz? What about Elihu over there? Have you thought about him lately? No. Zophar? No. Those guys weren't even in the conversation. They wouldn't have lasted any time. No time at all. Because they weren't perfect and upright and eschewed evil. They thought wicked things of their friends. They didn't think good things. Despite the false charges, Job knew he was innocent. He wasn't living in sin. And the righteous man who understands he is righteous, he will continue to grow in faith and become stronger and stronger. Even studying the book of Daniel, we see that progression with Daniel, don't we? He becomes more faithful and stronger and stronger and stronger. You don't see fear in Daniel. You don't see him becoming weaker. You see him becoming stronger. That's what faithfulness does to you. So Job issued a challenge here. They had assaulted his character, though their charges, and notice they couldn't come up with a specific charge. They were all general charges. Well, you've sinned. Well, in what way? Well, you've just sinned because if you hadn't, bad things wouldn't happen to you. Well, that's no answer. They hadn't shown any wisdom in their previous attacks. And so here's the thing. Job says, yeah, I don't see your wisdom getting any better moving into the future. I don't see you gaining any wisdom, moving ahead. We'll get down to verse 12 here in chapter 17. That's kind of a difficult verse a little bit. He uses the word they. I think he's talking about or referring to his inner thoughts. When you are in absolute misery and you have reached what you believe is rock bottom, who are you stuck with? Yourself. Of all the people you cannot get away from, you are stuck with yourself. And I think that's what Job is talking about here in verse 12. His inner thoughts. Your inner thoughts can help you improve the situation mentally, even if you can't physically, or it can help make things worse. And he makes that statement here. My gloom turns to hope, but only for just a little while, because then gloom starts rushing right back in. Now, some folks think it's his friends. They are his friends. I don't really believe it's his friends. It very well could be, but I don't see that his friends have ever given him any hope throughout this whole thing. But if it is his friends, this is how I see maybe how it could be. His friends are offering him the idea of hope if he did what? Repents. If you'll repent, Job, you have hope. Well, how's that all? So, okay, you're going to offer me hope. Okay, great. I need some hope. So what is that? Well, repent. So, boom, gloom comes right back, because why? He hasn't done anything. He has nothing for which to repent. Okay, well, maybe it could be his friends, if you look at it like that. But I think it's his inner thoughts. He talks about his grave being his home, 13 through 14. He gives a vivid description of Sheol. He talks about the Haden realm in verse 13. Verse 14 talks about the corruption in the body. There's nothing glowing or good to think about there. That is just the way it is, though. The body goes down, the spirit goes up. This body is just a shell. It doesn't mean anything to us. It's the inner person, who we are. So we see that Job did have some kind of a rudimentary understanding of life after death, but he did not have what we have in the Christian dispensation. That's obvious to the Bible student. We get to chapter 18, and Bildad speaks up again. He hasn't said anything, I think, since chapter 8, maybe. And he says, and remember again, it's just they're getting more toxic as they move along. And he says, how long are you going to keep talking? It's just so infuriating how they're treating this man. He could not hold back. He demanded to know, how long is it going to be before you just shut up? Just take your medicine and be happy with it. He accused Job for just groping for words, just anything you can to reply. It doesn't even have to make sense. And Bildad told Job to listen closely, mark my words, and then maybe he and the others could do him some good. If you'll just listen to us, you might learn something. It's just the same old story. It's like they're just one piggybacking right off of the other, piling right on. So again, notice, one stops talking, and just as soon as Job takes a breath, one jumps right on him. He doesn't even have time to consider what's happening. And notice what they're doing. They're not even considering what Job says. They're just talking louder and longer. It seems to me, again, they think Job is not even hearing the word they're saying, but he's answering their argument. He's answering their arguments. He's trying to get them to pay attention and be reasonable. So Bildad asks Job, he says, do you think that we're vicious beasts, that we've just torn at you? And do you think we're vile? Well, I mean, to me, that ought to be a rhetorical question. Of course Job believes that. And unless you haven't been, see, and to me that's a sign that they aren't listening to Job, because I think he's pretty well put that out there. He's explained that to them. Because they've done way more than tear their friend down. They certainly haven't encouraged him. They've done their best to destroy them, destroy him. So finally, he asked if he thought that God should forsake the earth for Job's benefit. So, in Bildad's view, God has this set up in such a way that every single sin is punished. Every wicked person who sins, you get punished, and you get punished right now. That's just the way it is. And so, Job, this is what's happening to you, and now you're over here claiming that you haven't done anything. Do you believe for a second God ought to just turn the world upside down for you? You just change the way things are. Because the way you're behaving, that's what it seems like. You want God to change the way things are for Job. It makes no sense whatever. So, and then Bildad listed the inevitable troubles that come upon the wicked. Now, what he listed can be very accurate for wicked people, but not always. Sometimes wicked people don't have any of these problems, right? But certainly he's wrong if he applies them to Job. A sinful man's light will go out. He'll live in darkness. Well, certainly that's going to happen. But what does that have to do with Job? You could say that about any person living in sin. His light has gone out. He's living in darkness. That doesn't mean he's suffering physically. What Bildad said is so misguided, and implying it to Job is 100% off. But the idea is you reap what you sow. Well, obviously that's a biblical concept of reaping what you sow. But you don't always reap what you sow in the physical world. You always reap what you sow in the afterlife. And that is the concept of reaping what you sow in the hereafter. Sometimes you reap what you sow in this life, but not always. Not always. Bildad continued to speak about Job ensnaring himself. You set a trap for other people, and you ensnared yourself. That was the idea of verses 9 through 12. In verses 11 through 21, he talked about being hunger-bitten. Terrors pursuing the wicked, driving him to his feet in panic, and people who have done wicked things in this life, and we've all known people like this. I mean, I grew up with a bunch of people like this. People who don't obey the law, for instance, who deal in criminal activity. Are they paranoid? And that's basically what he's talking about. Are they paranoid? Well, sure they're paranoid. Every time they hear a police car go by, they start looking over their back because they know they've done something and it may be their time to be caught. And that's what Bildad is talking about. Okay? This idea of being hunger bitten is you become weak and you're on the run. All right? You might be able to operate on adrenaline. You get scared, and you might be able to operate on adrenaline for a little while, but that runs out, right? And now you're on the run. You're out of money. You're out of food, and finally you're at the mercy of your enemies. You see, David, when he numbered the people, he had a choice. Be at the mercy of your enemies, have a plague for a while. I don't remember, there was another one, but David said, I want to be at the mercy of God, not the mercy of my enemies. Because you don't want to be out of funds, out of food, and on the run and at the mercy of your enemies. He understood that. And that's what this idea is right here. But people who live in sin, dried up, the roots are dried up, the limbs are cut off, you're not going to bear fruit, right? That's what happens to the wicked person. Chapter 19, Job cried out, but he's not heard. His spirits are at the lowest level of any point in the book here. He didn't even respond to Bildad. He just made a complaint against the situation. And he wanted to know from his friends, and I love this statement. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the idea. How long do you plan on annoying me and frustrating me and afflicting me in my situation? This is how he described it. You're breaking me in pieces. You're breaking me in pieces. Again, words can sometimes be much harsher than physical blows. He says he accused them of reproaching him 10 times. That number 10 plays a role in biblical terminology. It means a great number of times, right? A great number of times you have reproached me. He talks about his close friends, his family. They turned away from him. The only people that have come to him, his close kin didn't come to him, are these 3 friends. And he said, y'all are the most miserable of company I've ever had. But in verses 20 through 29, he talks about his Redeemer. This is one of the greatest passages in the book of Job. He asked for compassion, and then he questioned his friends here. He said, why do you bring persecution instead like God is able to do? He said, the idea here is you are putting yourself in the place of God. You could come and comfort me, but you do not have the authority to bring persecution like God does. So again, he's falling back on this idea, incorrectly believing God has punished him, but at least God has the authority to do that because he is sovereign, right? Now, this Redeemer here he's talking about is obviously the Lord, and Job expressed his hope that he would be vindicated at the appropriate time. So we see the growth in Job from the beginning all the way up through at least to this point. Now he knows that his Redeemer lives. He always lives. He will never die, right? And so he is convinced now that he is going to be vindicated. So let me ask this question to you. At what point in the history of time was Job saved by his Redeemer? Absolutely. He was saved at the cross. He was saved at the cross. Everyone who ever lived prior to the cross who was faithful to God was saved at the cross. That's when he was truly vindicated. Finally, Job warned his friends of the punishment coming to them for their harsh treatment of him, and that wrath directed toward him, in essence, he was saying, may very well be directed toward you. When we look in chapter 20, we can quickly break it up. Zophar again hastily replied to Job, verses 1 through 7. He didn't even pay attention to him. In verses 8 through 14, he talked about the wicked fly away like a dream. When we dream, a dream seems very real to us until we wake up, right? It seems like we're right there. I had the craziest dream the other night. I won't go into it. It's too embarrassing. But I thought this is the craziest thing that has ever happened to me. And fortunately, I woke up. That's what Zophar is talking about. And similarly, Zophar saying the sinner will just as quickly vanish as a dream in the night. Right? Those who know the sinner are going to not remember him anymore. His home, his business, his entire worldly situation going to be taken away. So what happened to Job? Didn't all that stuff, wasn't that destroyed? Zophar is saying, Job, that's you. That's you. He paid no attention to what Job had said or had previously said. He says, you are just like that. Your wealth is going to be taken from you and given back to everyone you cheated. Now, where's the evidence Job was ever a cheater or ever cheated anyone? It's not there. God will take away the wicked's wealth. The wicked will flee. So what he's talking about there in verses 24 through the end of the chapter, he said, Job, you're going to suffer from wounds of war. After all, everything else is taken away from you. Your herds, your family, your home, your wealth, all that kind of stuff. So you will also suffer in war. You're going to be fleeing. Now, again, much of what Zophar said is true, but he greatly exaggerated everything. And he made the mistake of applying that to Job. So these men were absolutely saying the wrong things because none of it applied to Job. Job, simply put, when we study the book of Job, had nothing to do with him. He was only collateral damage. It was all about, is God worthy of worship? I mean, there are about 4 or 5 things that apply to what the book is about, but ultimately it boils down to is a battle between God and Satan. Is God worthy of worship? And Job was collateral damage. These men weren't paying attention to Job at all. All right, we'll pick up there next time. Thank you.